This House believes that corporations only have a duty to their shareholders. Judging with me is Abel and Eric.
Yeah.
And in government today we have KIDA. And in opposition today we have NUSA. You guys ready? Right, that's it. It gives me great pleasure to now call this House to order and invite the first speaker, Prime Minister Starbucks.
Mr. Chair, Samsung designed the first Android phones in order to make free applications accessible to middle-class citizens in order to appease their interests of their shareholders. Hyundai provided and innovated in terms of creating the first energy-efficient car that doesn't use fuel in order to be the first mover in that market in order to appease their shareholders. What we'd like to tell you coming from government side at the end of the day is that companies should not extend their services in order to provide corporate social responsibility and charity. And the very fact that these companies exist and the very idea that they provide invaluable products to people that make their lives a lot more meaningful is already enough and is already a legitimate basis for these companies to exist. Government side stands on two things in today's debate. The first thing we would say is that corporations should not have to extend its responsibility to doing acts of goodwill or charity if it does not appease their shareholders. Sit down. The second thing we would say is that the only responsibility for these companies is to fulfill the bare minimum standards that states expect them for them. So this is going to be explicit. We're not going to defend criminal acts coming from these companies, right? Because that's clearly illegitimate. We don't support illegal logging by paper companies. We don't support the degradation of seas by oil companies because of them building pipelines near these areas. We think if these acts of crimes are committed, we think that they should still be held liable by the courts of those places. What we're focusing more on this debate when we talk about morally obligatory acts is corporate social responsibility. So what we would say is that Macintosh does not have the responsibility nor the moral obligation to provide free computers to poor children in India. We don't think that Nike also has a moral obligation to provide free apparel to suffering children within that state. So, now that that context is clear, I have two ideas as Prime Minister I want to talk about. The first idea I want to talk about is why we think democratic societies should not impose moral obligations of corporate social responsibility. The second thing I want to talk about is why we think these corporations invaluably benefit societies more when shareholders are appeased.
Before I go on, considering that corporate profits are predicated upon the property of the commons, why is there no moral obligation?
Because we think that we also benefit the commons at the end of the day when shareholders are appeased. Because, as I'm going to explain later, the more these companies innovate, the more these shareholders are appeased, the more jobs that these corporations get. More on that later. Let's go to this first idea about democratic societies and moral obligations. What we would say is that democratic societies put premium on self-determination and the right of the individual to maximize economic opportunities granted to him. So we think at the end of the day, the role of the state is to provide a market where everybody, or a market that's easily accessible to a lot of people within that state. That's why if you take a look at the states, more of their common goals are to provide a minimum salary or minimum welfare so that people have spending power, so that people have the ability to save in order to purchase products and to perhaps provide opportunities for jobs themselves. They try to keep inflation low, so it allows businesses to prosper even more so that people sit down can actually put their products which they've innovated into the market and provide them the opportunity to sell their ideas or to sell that knowledge. What we would say is that corporations got rich because of the ingenuity of the people that sets its foundations to begin with. So we don't buy this idea that corporations got rich because they ripped off governments or because they have, they access loopholes within states. Because we think at the end of the day, they would still be held accountable. So the reason why the founders of Google got rich was because they provided an invaluable social benefit to people by providing them access to information in a way which they've never had before. Founders of Twitter got rich because they provided a mechanism for people to sit down to bridge them no matter which community community they belong to. And they've also provided avenues for people to tweet about the social ills that befall their specific states. Like the fact that Twitter was used in the Iranian Revolution and whatnot. There are three conclusions that we want to draw from this line of premise. The very first thing we would say is that the very fact that they have provided invaluable goods to people means that the state should already recognize their stature as they are. Because this has to be comparative.
Okay, all that debate.
Sit down. We think moral obligations are extended to people when there's an active incitement of harm if they don't fulfill that obligation. But in fact, we think that the state should even compensate these people for providing those services, for providing those goods, which wouldn't have been provided if they were there. Sit down. The second thing we would say is that it's fundamentally incommensurate to rob these people of their money's worth, right? Because it was their very own idea, it was their very own research. At the end of the day, if somebody got rich right now, we don't see any reason why you want to rob his money's worth. We think providing or expecting moral obligations from these people means that you're telling them that their savings and their shareholders must be compromised to doing social acts which might not be in their better interests. We think that's fundamentally unfair. Sit down. But the next thing we would say on this argument about harm is if they say that, well, there's harms that accrue because of the acts that these corporations do, we think that we can credit people more for these harms than the corporations themselves, and we can credit people for the free will of inciting this harm. For example, if you got fat or you got cancer because you bought McDonald's, we don't think that we can blame McDonald's because of that. And we don't think we can blame McDonald's for not providing nutritional facts. Because it was your very own will, it was your very own free volition to access or purchase that product to begin with. No. Let's go to the second idea about why we think these corporations invaluably benefit societies more when shareholders are post. The very first thing we would say is that the goal of shareholders is to make the most profit. And we're not going to lie, we're not going to make dreamy characterizations that these people want to be accountable to anything. And we think the goal and the interests of these shareholders to make profit is inherently linked to the growth of the company. Because the farther the services of that company reach, the more companies they establish their basis on, the more profit these shareholders can get. So we think this inherent drive for money actually benefits people a lot more because it extends the services of the companies to benefits. The first thing we think it does is it makes employment opportunities a lot more available when we appease these shareholders. Because if you take a look at the trend nowadays when it comes to companies, is always to go transnational, to extend their markets to people. Like Nike always goes transnational so it can extend its products to poor people in Bangladesh. We think inherently appeasing Nike's shareholders means that poor people in Bangladesh who never got jobs to begin with will get that job because of that extended market that Nike underwent. The second thing we would do is that we would say is that reducing the need for CSR actually makes products cheaper and a lot more available for people. If Apple had the responsibility to provide Macs or free Macs to people, that means that there's less of a gain in their profit, and that means that they have to sell their Macs a lot more expensive to people to cut back or to recover that cost. We think not having to use corporate social responsibilities means that these companies can instead focus their money on innovation, instead focus their money on developing these products easier, and therefore making it cheaper and more available for people. Mr. Chair, we don't think that corporations have a moral responsibility to undergo CSR. We think the very fact that they exist and they provide invaluable services is enough. We're very proud to propose.
Right, so thank the speaker for his speech, and we now invite the first speaker of the opposition team.
We don't think this debate is only about whether or not corporations should provide charity to other individuals. We think this debate is also about recognizing that if you want to defend the profit motivation of companies and profiteering at the expense of society, you also have to defend the instances where companies pursue profit at the expense of society, even performing actions that are technically legal, but still harm society as a whole, still harm people involved. And we think they have run away from this particular burden in in this instance, right? And what we are going to argue today is that we think there are instances where the pursuit of profits comes at the expense of society, harms others, harms workers, harms the communities involved, and that even if these things are illegal, and that these things enhance the profits of companies, that companies have moral obligations not to pursue these things, sometimes use our profits so that society as a whole can benefit. I'm going to talk about two things today. First of all, the relationship between the corporation and society and why the moral obligation exists. Second of all, why the existence of the moral obligation benefits society as a whole and why it's better under our model. Before that, some rebuttals. The first thing is told us that they are willing to, they're saying that corporations have minimum responsibility to obey the law. We think that's good. But there are two things that they don't understand in this debate, right? The first is that corporations offer an immense ability to influence the laws that are being made, to try to actually exercise political power, to ensure that the laws benefit them as much as possible, right, at the expense of society. And we think that the moral obligation of companies to ensure that the regulations that are being put in place, while sometimes may limiting the monopoly power or the power of these corporations, recognize that benefit society as a whole and acquiesce and support the enforcement of these regulations. Second of all, corporations are also very able to find loopholes within these regulations to exploit, for example, use lobbyists to exploit the enforcement of these particular laws to ensure they are not actually properly enforced or regulated. And we don't think it's something corporations have a moral responsibility to do, right? Before that, Daryl.
Then these laws should be made stronger and it should be legislation. Why does it have to be that corporations are assumed to be guilty before something is committed?
No, but you can't just say laws will be made stronger without recognizing the context in which laws are being made and the role that corporations play in the shaping of those laws. When you talk about the moral responsibility or obligation of corporations, we think that the obligation to ensure that the laws are being crafted, while sometimes may work against our narrow self-interest, can benefit society as a whole. Next, he told us that opportunities are individuals with their own ideas and own research, right? And we're not going to explain why we don't think that action can only be that conception that it's your own money, your own ideas that formed it can be bad. But before that, right? One is the major problem with this argument is that it does not recognize that sometimes the actions of corporations and pursuit of profit don't always benefit society. They don't always engage in innovation. They don't always engage in kind of things that benefit society as a whole. Because corporations are able to use things like, for example, the abuse of monopoly power to increase their profits without anybody else benefiting, only their particular shareholders. We see this, for example, in the patent wars that are ongoing between Android, between Google, between Apple, between Samsung now, which companies are swinging each other left, right, center over who has violated each other's patents. Things that actually undermine innovation in the smartphone market. So we see that, for example, Apple has attempted to get the Samsung Galaxy Tab banned in Europe, right? And the particular action, while increasing the profits of Apple, is harmful for the consumers here because they have access to less diversity, they have access to less choices. So the pursuit of profit doesn't always benefit everybody, but sometimes can only benefit the shareholders with nobody else benefiting. Last of all, he said that cheap products are good, somehow actually good. But he didn't defend today why the cheap products, cheap iPads and iPhones that people build around are somehow so important to us that they're worth the lives of the people who died at Foxconn. He hasn't defended to us today why the people who long, menial hours at Foxconn who suffer under the conditions that produce there are somehow not as important as us maybe getting $100 cheaper iPhone. We don't think that's more popular than they can defend in today's debate. Going on to my substantives, right? The nature of corporations and obligations. I'm going to split this into two parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the impact that corporations have upon society. Second, I'm going to talk about how society supports and sustains them. Rebutting directly their idea that some corporations do all this because of the genius of their own inventors. First argument. We recognize that often there are benefits, right, with these kind of situations, and corporations and innovations that they create. They are often formed by profits by individuals or with the pursuit of profit. But we must understand that corporations have a huge impact on society in the way they structure market relations, in the way that economies and entire communities build themselves around the demands of certain corporations, and the way that communities engage in market relations, often heavily influenced by how these companies act in the first place. We see, for example, Starbucks, right, in pursuing fair trade, has helped to shape the calculus of plantation owners to move away from big plantations, to move away from exploitative labor, to encourage the kind of growth of cooperative farms that we think is better for society, even if it leads to more expensive coffee beans for Starbucks at the present. Right, we see, for example, the corporations with immense power, the ability to shape relations policy. Walmart today, right, having huge power amount, the kind of things that they order, when they decide to place orders for green products instead of cheaper but more polluting products, this shapes market relations because now people pursue these greener products and instead which benefits society and the environment as a whole. Secondly, we see that immense power in society because of the ability to influence politics and shape the public discourse. We see in America today the ability of corporations to donate money to things like super PACs, to run advertisements that support politicians who they think are supporting their side. We see the ability of corporations to use the power of lobbyists in order to ensure the laws they pass are in their favor. We think that when corporations do so, when corporations exercise such power, they have a moral obligation to society to ensure that even though they may want to benefit, sometimes their benefit cannot come at the expense of society. Next, how society in fact supports and sustains these particular companies. And what they don't understand today is that often society structures itself in a way that enables these companies to succeed. We see things like, for example, the rule of law or the growth in property rights, which allows them to be secure in their own communities and allow them to be secure in ensuring they pursue profit without getting robbed by others or getting robbed by the government, right? They want to talk about Google and Twitter, but the internet was a device that was funded and developed by a public agency, the defense agency, right? Things that supported and sustained the ability of Google and Twitter to sustain themselves. Google and Twitter are sustained by a network of laws that enable them to flourish in the first place and pursue and the peace that the government and society as a whole provides to these particular corporations. Right? Next, I think that what often happens is that furthermore, when companies fail their obligations, when companies fail their responsibilities, governments and societies are the ones left picking up the tab and clearing up after them. See, for example, when BP used loopholes in regulations, right, to reduce its ability to take care of the oil drill and ignore the fact that the maintenance of the oil is important. What happened was that the oil spill happened, the people in Louisiana, the fisheries, and the people who depended on the Louisiana waters to sustain their livelihoods were the ones most deeply impacted by this. And the governments were forced to clean up the oil spill, they were forced to sustain these communities that BP was ultimately only partially responsible for. Next argument, right? Why we think this is better? And the basic point here is that when companies pursue social responsibility, even at the expense of short-term profits, right? We think that's better for society because we understand today the motivation of shareholders is often short-term in nature. So they're pursuing the short-term nature of profits because they're able to get more dividends or their share price increase in value. But we think that under our model, right, companies have a social responsibility. They better engage in actions to benefit society, engage in better regulation. See, for example, Tata in India, right, building villages, for example, sustain whole communities there. They come at the expense of profits, but enable the communities of to succeed. And this is the kind of corporations that we need to celebrate and encourage in this today. For this reason, very, very proud to propose.
Right, so thank the speaker for his speech, and we now invite the second speaker of the government.
Mr. Speaker, corporations might do externalities that sometimes harm the environment or may sometimes damage people, but it doesn't prove that just because these things happen that a duty is there to exist. Because what you have to understand is that the important thing with a duty are two things. That firstly, a duty implies that it's the only way for you to achieve an end or to actually reduce externalities, and secondly, you're the only stakeholder that can actually do something about it. That is why they have to have a gravity in the situation before you have to have the moral duty to do something in of itself. What we're going to say is simple. Corporations are not perfect. No institution is perfect, but corporations in the way they are already enough. There's a reason why capitalism has survived for this long. It's because even if it's imperfect, all other systems are even more imperfect and might even damage the way that we see society, the way we live society. I'm going to talk about three things really. First, I really want to bring back this idea of what really makes a duty in the very first place. Secondly, I want to talk about the idea of an instrumental rationality and how we can achieve maximum welfare for everyone. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the divide of duties within institutions. I'm going to tell you that, corporations are not the only institutions out there and why it's particularly harmful if we're going to reorient this specific institution into the other orientations of the same institutions we're talking about, like the state, the church, and all these things. First, let's rebut the ideas that Hong Yu made in this debate. The first argument, the biggest argument that they're making is this. The idea that there are externalities that are technically legal. So laws, for example, that pass through the loopholes of states, corporations making decisions that actively harm other people. What we're going to say is that yes, Sometimes corporations might make decisions that may or may not be true. But that's in the same way that states might make decisions that may or may not be true. What's the point? Firstly, what I told you is that people are complicit in these things. What we're going to say is that the burden can be given specifically to corporations. Because we do think that it's a duty that is not exclusive to them, but actually falls on the people who buy these things in the very first place. And what we're going to say is that if you so much about killing, then when the buying stops, the killing stops as well. You can't say the corporations created this evil, because the point is everyone was complicit in creating this evil in the very first place. Secondly, what we're going to say is that when you do make externalities, that somehow the law does not cover, or the state fails to compensate for THBT. What we're going to say is that this is not the failure of corporations in and of itself, but a failure of other institutions. What you are doing is to invisibilize the failure of these other institutions as well. When you say, for instance, that BP, that the oil spill, when you say, for instance, that BP is the only actor responsible for the oil spill happening in the Gulf of Mexico, maybe you're missing the point. Maybe what you're saying essentially is that the state didn't have any hand in this, even if it was the state that actually created the environment in order for these things to happen in the very first place. What you're doing is to say that the states and other institutions have no responsibility even if they created the conditions that actually make these things worse in the very first place. So what was their response to you? They say that, for instance, we might have land lobbying and all these things, we might have narrow self-interest. Again, this only proves that the burden should not fall on corporations, because it's also lawmakers and politicians that allow lobbying to take place in the very first place. And these are the people that we actually also have to give the burden to. So sit down. Secondly, they tell us that sometimes the profits only get to stakeholders, to shareholders. The first thing we're going to say is this. We're not going to just an example really of the gas being banned in Europe. We're going to say that this ban was not because of corporations having a monopoly, but because of intellectual property rights, which is another thing altogether. But even more to the point, what we're going to say is that profits do exist even into the hardest of their burdens. Because even when you have a monopoly, you still create things like lower prices, for instance, or maybe not even that, but even better employment. You might be able to revitalize entire communities by giving them employment the same way that we created Hershey, Pennsylvania, for instance. So what we're going to say is this: even in their worst of context, there is still a benefit and there's a profit that can be had in the creation of corporations. Before I proceed,
You said that everyone was complicit in the harm that's foisted upon them. Explain to me how exactly the people in Bhopal were responsible for the Bhopali disaster.
I'm not sure what you mean. Here's the thing. In any sort of instances, what we see is that people are complicit. Maybe, for instance, number one, they did buy the products of the corporations. Maybe they want the goods and the services of the corporations. But maybe they didn't actually fight for these things that are happening, in the very first place. What we're going to say is that even in the worst of disasters, there's always an element of complicity within the people. There's always an element of other institutions failing these people. And what we're saying when we say that corporations have to do the stakeholders, only have a duty to stakeholders, is saying that we can't invisibilize these problems with other institutions. What's my first argument here? First, I want to ask what a duty really is. We're going to say that a duty implies that this is the only way to achieve an end. That's why a state duty exists, because we recognize that the state is the only institution that might be able to do something in terms of the social political realm. So only with these two things is the gravity getting action. Only when these things are achieved is there an idea of a duty being fulfilled. But the second thing I want to talk about is the idea of instrumental rationality. What is the concept of instrumental rationality? What we would say is that if institutions are left to their own devices, that's how we achieve maximum welfare. Corporations, for instance, if left to their own devices, are able to create employment, revitalize communities, and all of these things. So, even without a duty, corporations create welfare best by taking care of their shareholders. Because this idea of competition is what drives them to create employment and give other external benefits to society. But on the second level of this argument, we're going to say is that an enforced duty reduces the ability of corporations to provide welfare. Because instrumental rationality only works if corporations enjoy a specific modicum of freedom, if there is no imposition or no pressure imposed on them in terms of their mindset. A duty essentially is an enforced corporate social responsibility that drains your resources and changes your calculus. And if your resources are drained, your ability to be competitive is also drained. That means you can't lower your prices, for instance, or you can't provide as much employment. But in that sense, people still lose out because they don't enjoy these low prices, or they don't enjoy these high employment. But the second thing I want to talk about is this idea of the divide of duties. Because what we say, corporations are not the only institutions in society. See, the division of duties means that there is no all-encompassing institution. When you look at it, the corporations only exist in an economic realm, and we have other things to take, other institutions to divide when corporations were made exclusively and only to create profit. So it's unnecessary to make a duty because each institution already deals with the externalities of the other. When the church, for instance, might create the doctrines that the states might be resolved later on, they cover up for each other. But what's the harm here? The reason why the division has to exist is because you need discourse and weight. Because if everyone is oriented towards the same mindset, what you have is a mindset that is unerring, that is unchanging, that might not be able to see all other perspectives out there. Such that eventually what might happen is to damage the welfare of these other institutions and these other actors at the very end of the day. That's the reason why there needs to be a division of duties. That's the reason why corporations should be allowed to only take care of their stakeholders. The problem is, when everyone has the same goal, we might not have the end we wanted. And for this very reason, Mr. Chair, we're very happy to close.
Right, thanks speaker for your speech and invite second speaker from the opposition team.
Okay, I'm going to stop Ateneo from confusing this debate even further. So what is this debate really? We concede that when profiteerism is defended as a value, there will be benefits. Someone will use the phone, someone probably had a job in making the phone. But just because some benefits exist, doesn't mean that the moral duty that is incumbent upon these companies are automatically and fully discharged. Because if you want to defend profiteerism as an absolute value, then you've got to defend almost everything associated with profiteerism. For example, in the naked pursuit of corporate profits, things like, for example, medical benefits are basically not really accorded to individuals so they can increase their profit margins. That's why we see the plight as foisted upon people in Foxconn, operating on maybe 13 cents an hour for 14 hours a day without any form of significant medical coverage. Or for example, environmental regulation. When in the naked pursuit of corporate profits, companies like ExxonMobil basically are single-minded in their pursuit of degrading the environment to get as much oil as possible so they can stockhold them and go and sell them on their own whims and fancies. If it's just about profiteerism, these are the problems that you need to solve. But it's beyond profiteerism. Because what we want to do is establish the most optimal relationship between these corporations and the rest of society. And for this to happen, profiteerism must be fettered so that other areas are taken care of. Let's review the arguments coming one by one, right? So my point of substantive will be about how there's a monopoly of information by these corporations and why that's bad. But my rebuttals are always, incorporate news points and substantive anyway. So let's go to the first argument about the free will of people. What is more reasonable? For them to argue that corporations are never ever responsible for anything that goes wrong, or that everybody basically owes some kind of moral obligation because almost everybody is responsible to some extent in these problems. What we would argue on our side, in fact, is that these corporations are usually extremely culpable for the actions that they're talking about. On the example of the Bhopali disaster, which I knew nothing about. Like basically what happened in this instance, the people of Bhopal, all they did was just went to bed at night like any other day. But because Union Carbide regularly and consistently failed to check the way they were carrying out their operations because it was expensive to them, what basically happened is that the chemicals basically leaked, and for 20 years onwards, people in Bhopal are still suffering the effects of the Bhopali disaster. In those instances where they are extremely culpable, we think they owe a moral obligation. We don't deny that other institutions may owe a moral obligation as well, but it's also incumbent upon these companies right now. Not only that, right? What do we see? When exactly do people owe a moral obligation? My voice is extremely sexy today. They argue that the price mechanism itself has already taken into account and fully discharged these companies of any moral obligation, right? They say, look, the fact that you can use your phone, the fact that you even have a phone, means that I have no more moral obligation to you, even though I use your profits. But why is that not the case? Because even though Mac basically profited from almost everything, the benefits didn't quite trickle down to the rest of the community. The people who got rich were within the Macintosh company itself. The people in Foxconn, even sometimes the people who actually manufacture and produce the hardware that you're talking about, didn't really feel the trickle-down effect of your profits at all. Not only that, the communities that these people predicated themselves on didn't get it. So what we are basically arguing for is that what we want to do is to distribute the utility that comes from it, and we don't think the price mechanism is enough. But they ignored the nuances coming from Hong Yu's speech, right? And they never quite dealt with it at all. Firstly, the fact that your corporate profits were derived from the property of the commons. For example, the Western Australian mining companies. The only reason why they got successful was because they came into Western Australia and they basically mined the property that belonged to the people. Or for example, Elizabeth Warren's arguments that the only reason why corporations can make the profits that they can because they benefit from things like roads. They benefit from things like, for example, labor that people have. The people people have a proprietary interest in the corporate profits that you create, and therefore you owe the moral obligation back to them. The promise, for example, secondly, the promise that you make to the people as well. Like companies like Ford Motor Company in Michigan, basically give them, the promise that if you were to work, if you were to work for us, you do what the best for yourself, you get protected by your labor unions, and then more often than not, you will achieve the American dream, right? The middle income class nirvana. But if you don't even want to take care of these people, then you're basically not discharging the obligations that you promised to these people. Or thirdly, right, the idea that cities and laws were built to support these institutions. For example, again in Flint, Michigan, that because Flint, Michigan wanted to rely heavily on the Ford Motor Company for the development of the local economy, what they did was that the mayor regularly went by the board of directors in the Ford Motor Company whenever they wanted to pass policies. Because they recognized that they want to accommodate these corporations as far as possible. Recognizing that these cities basically bend themselves backwards to support you, that obligation exists. Fourthly, the idea of cleaning up, right? The fact that the obligation is upon the city to clean up, but never was responded by the other side. Next, we go on to the next argument. Why are they better? Because when they're profit, they're not just profit driven, but they care about the people. They help in taking into account things, for example, medical benefits, even at the expense of profit margins. Things, for example, taking care of the environment. But you disagree.
You need capital in order to bring about every benefit that you just mentioned. How will you have access to that capital in a model which neglects?
This is the argument, right? And we're talking about, when you don't allow companies to make more profits, then they have fewer jobs, and therefore as a result, people suffer. True, there might be fewer jobs, but at what cost, right? Basically, better protection of the environment. Take, for example, better welfare policies that belong and more accessible to a lot more people within the community than a small number of people who actually work for you. That's the trade-off that we're looking for and the kind of benefits that they do provide on that side of the house. But more importantly, why is it better? Because if you're looking at companies right now, they're consistently and constantly trying to circumvent regulations that are meant to curb the kind of instincts on the part of these companies. This is the reason why the Dodd-Frank Act is still like hundreds of pages, but without any form of effective resolution. Because these corporations regularly try to pay off lobbyists to try and circumvent these laws. And that's the problem. The reason why the credit crunch came about was because the CPFP couldn't act fast enough in correspondence with these companies to regulate their behavior. In the interim, what happened? Thousands upon thousands of people lost jobs. Thousands upon thousands of people were kicked out of their houses. Never ever dealt with by the other side. So why is the monopoly over information necessarily a bad thing? In the world today, we need to recognize that corporations spend a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars, into manipulating the information that is made available to the people. In fact, if you look at all the petroleum companies, what they're doing is that they're investing into research and development, they're researching into think tanks to produce the counter discourse within the dialectical discourse about climate change. So why is this problematic? Because these companies owe so much and have so much money, they're able to fund so many research and development and think tanks out there, they're able to create a very strong counter discourse. That's why some people are basically arguing that climate change is not necessarily a true thing. And recognizing the amount of money they put into this, and recognizing the way they're assaulting people with information, and the fact that people usually only access information that comes directly from these kind of companies, it's impossible for people to act as an effective check against these corporations to get the most socially optimal policies created in these instances. That's why even though climate change is basically burning the shit out of the world, and I don't know why it's keep wearing jackets even though the temperature keeps going out by a degree every freaking year, right? The problem is because the people are feeding off information that might not necessarily be true, that's manipulated by these corporations, we can't form the most effective check against corporations. That's why they need to owe a moral obligation beyond just naked profiteerism. And for these reasons, I'm extremely proud.